Begin. Okay, hi. Welcome everybody to today's colloquium. This is the Animals and Society Colloquium. It is co-sponsored by the Animals and Society Institute, ASI, and the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. I'm one of your hosts today. My name is Carol Glasser. I am a professor of sociology at Minnesota State University in Mankato, and I am also currently have the privilege of being the chair of the Animals and Society section of ASA. If you are a sociologist and you are a member of ASA and are not a member of our section, I encourage you to join the section and feel free to message me if you have any interest or questions about that. I would like to introduce you now to Gayla Argent to tell you a little bit about Animals and Society Institute.
Thanks, Carol. Yes, I'm the program director of Human Animal Studies at the Animals and Society Institute, and we are a think tank that focuses on human-animal relationships and human-animal studies. We have a ton of resources for scholars, for teachers, for faculty, for students, and for mental health practitioners on our website, which Carol has put up there with a link to the colloquiums, but you can get to all of that information from that link. And if you aren't a member yet, we have memberships available that you can also see. Thanks.
Thank you. Just before I introduce the talk, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the format. Because of the overwhelming interest in this webinar, we've turned it into a webinar format. So the only people you'll see on the screen are the hosts. And then, of course, you'll see Dr. Lindsay Palmer. We have both a chat going and a Q&A. So you can be posting comments in the chat as we go along during the talk. But if you have a specific question that comes up for Dr. Palmer, please put it in the Q&A and I will be moderating that. And during the Q&A, I'll make sure that I ask those questions. We're going to let the speaker speak and she'll speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So if questions pop up as something is said, please just pop them in the Q&A and then we can get to them when we get to that part of the talk. If you have any issues during the talk and need to reach out to me, you can always just message the host in the webinar chat. Okay, so with that, let's get this started. You are not here to hear me speak, I know that. Today's colloquium is called Kicking the Dog. The endorsement of hegemonic masculinity predicts the endorsement of aversive training methods. Today, our talk is being presented by Dr. Lindsay Palmer. Lindsay Palmer is a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of Population and Quantitative Health Sciences at UMass-Chan Medical School. She received her Ph.D. in psychology and women's, gender, and sexuality studies from Penn State. Her research program leverages a feminist perspective in the study of social issues, the human-animal bond, health disparities, and behavioral interventions. So with that, I'm excited to turn our presentation over to Dr. Palmer.
Hi, everybody. Let me just go ahead and share screen really quick. So thank you, Carol, and for the introduction. So I am Dr. Lindsay Palmer, and I will be talking to you all today about some research that I'm really excited to present to you. I've been working on this project with Drs. Albone and Adams, graduate student Jude Sullivan, Dr. Jess Matzik, and our lovely postbac in our lab, Dylan Brandt. So typically the way that I start this talk is I start with talking about sort of the history of behavioral modification. And I talk about how a lot of the behavioral modification paradigms that we use on animals, and particularly dogs, we've actually used on people. And so I begin with this article from 1976 about the use of electric shock in the behavior modification of children with autism. But today I really wanted to just get to the point and talk about why I even talk about that. And as a shameless plug for humanity, one of the reasons why I start with talking about that is that when we raise the standards by which we treat animals, we inevitably raise the standards by which we treat people. So we have sorts of phrases in our language like treating someone like a dog, but what if we revisioned or reimagined what treating someone like a dog meant? And so during the talk today, I just sort of want you all to keep this in mind is what happens when we reimagine the way that we treat animals. So to begin, our overarching research question was, why do people use aversive methods to train dogs? And there's likely a ton of reasons that people use aversive methods to train dogs, but we were really looking at this through two pervasive cultural ideologies. So we were thinking about what people's beliefs were about dogs, but also sociocultural factors that might also impact their relationship with their pets. So we were thinking about what beliefs do people have about dominance theory and how it impacts their relationship? And then what sorts of beliefs do they have about hegemonic masculinity and how is that influencing their relationship? And both of these terms are going to be defined for you right now later in this presentation. So don't worry too much if you aren't sure what these things are right now. So if there are any dog trainers in this audience, I know that saying that the dominance theory controversy is the understatement of the year to call it a controversy. It's been quite contentious. And I know that as of late, there's been quite a resurgence too in this debate. And there's many organizations that have released position statements against using dominance theory as sort of a training orientation, and in part because they were concerned that the popularization of this theory on media, like shows like The Dog Whisperer, might be leading people to use aversive methods. The American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior is one such organization that has a pretty strong position statement. But, you know, as a part of this work, one of the things we wanted to look at is whether there really was this sort of causal relationship between dominance theory and aversive methods. And then we also thought that part of the reason why this relationship existed was because of our sociocultural beliefs. So what is an aversive? So essentially, you know, in behavior modification research and in learning theory, an aversive is typically something painful, forceful, or intimidating that you apply to an animal during a behavior modification paradigm, in particular positive punishment paradigms. And across species, we see some common fallout effects of aversives. So we actually see these fallout effects in both human and non-human animals. So we see things like escape, apathy, and some of the early studies in learned helplessness by Dr. Seligman and colleagues were actually done with dogs. In more contemporary studies, there's been a relationship between aversive training and stress in dogs, where we see that dogs who are trained with aversives are more likely to display aggression towards people and especially their owners during these sorts of training paradigms. And then in the human-animal bond, dogs trained with aversives tend to have some signs of lower quality relationships with their owners, like eye gaze. So they gaze at their owners a lot less or pursue or less spontaneously affectionate. So what is dominance theory? So primarily it's a lay theory about the social behavior of dogs and wolves that really focuses on the achievement of a singular alpha status. And importantly, an element in this theory is that in order for humans and canines to successfully cohabitate, humans must establish dominance over their dog. And often it's the act of dominating via aggression and competition that's focused. And I wanted to point out that dominance theory, often as it operates in popular culture, is different than nuanced scientific discourse in ethology and animal behavior. And so what we're talking today is not about research related to the social cognition and behavior of dogs, but we're looking at how the general public perceives dominance theory, how it is defined and operating within popular culture, and how it really contributes or influences our relationships with animals. So as a social psychologist, one of the things I noticed is that dominance theory seems to have a lot of overlap with other well-studied theories of social dominance. And in particular, I noticed a lot of overlap between hegemonic masculinity. And so hegemonic masculinity is a social construct of manhood or becoming a man that relies on traditional gender roles or idealized versions of being a man. And importantly, establishing dominance and control is really central to achieving this status. And so over here on the right, I have basically just a photo of the BEM sex roles inventory from 1974. So like I said, this has been studied for quite some time. And you can see some of the items that are associated with masculinity, words like competitive, literally the word dominant, forceful are in there. And then on the other side, words that are associated with femininity are things like affectionate. eager to soothe hurt feelings, gentle, and even on later inventories of where we're looking at things that are traditionally associated with masculinity or femininity, we actually see cares for animals more associated with feminine behaviors or characteristics. And importantly, interpersonal aggression or hostility is one way to maintain one's status and to establish oneself as dominant or this hegemonically masculine person. I wanted to also provide some visual aids here of hegemonic masculinity, because even if you haven't heard the term hegemonic masculinity, you have seen it play out in media. So over here, there is this word cloud of words that people typically associate with the traditional characteristics of men. And over here, you see like this oily, muscly man. You have your strong, assertive man over here in the corner. And then literally the definition of masculine is qualities or appearances traditionally associated with men, in particular, strength and aggressiveness. So masculinity is both a social identity and a cultural ideology. So on the one hand, masculinity is really important for men's identity and is proven through behaviors and attitudes. And so that's part of the reason why we were thinking that training based on establishing dominance and control would be particularly appealing to people with beliefs in hegemonic masculinity. But hegemonic masculinity is also a cultural ideology. So what I mean by that is that it's valued by regardless of your gender, and it exists within our social and political institutions. And so we know that our cultural beliefs often influence what is perceived as acceptable gendered behaviors and performances. And so putting it all together, within Western cultures, to be a man or to embody a masculine performance is to be high in power, status, and dominance, to be emotionally, physically, and mentally tough, and to reject and distance from all that is feminine, gay, or otherwise unmanly. We also know from research, I've put a bunch of citations at the bottom if you are really interested in looking at masculinity theory, but the endorsement of hegemonic masculinity is related to the endorsement of a wide variety of dominance-related ideologies. So for example, it's related to sexism. It's even related to something called social dominance orientation, which is sort of very simply, is the belief in social hierarchy between groups of people. And then in research related to masculinity threat and precarious masculinity, we see that when masculinity is threatened, when basically the idea is that when there is some sort of threat to the perception of people perceiving someone as very manly, that sometimes we see compensatory acts like physical aggression, sexual aggression, verbal aggression, and then social and economic punishment is also one way to establish oneself and reestablish oneself as like hegemonically masculine. And so I thought that this quote from the American Psychological Association, when we think about violence and interpersonal hostility as a masculinity resource, they really just sort of lay out really beautifully what is going on here. And so just to read this for you, is that masculine ideals, such as the restriction of emotional expression, the pressure to conform to the expectations of dominance and aggression, may heighten the potential for boys to engage in acts of violence, including but not limited to bullying, assault, and or physical or verbal aggression. And in the research that we have available between men and dogs, we actually sort of see some of these characteristics starting to play out. So we know that men are more likely to report using aversives, force, or other confrontational techniques on companion animals, and especially dogs. We also know that men who endorse hegemonic masculinity, traditional male role norms, are more likely to mask their affection and underreport their affection for their dogs. And we will be talking a little more about overt animal abuse later, but there's an article from 20 years ago that I think has a really great illustrative quote, and it's still very relevant today. So this data still holds true, is that one of the most consistent factors associated with the perpetration of animal abuse is gender. Almost all abusers are male, with the exception of animal hoarding. That is the instance where we see that women actually perpetrate more than men. So in study one, I wanted to sort of break down our questions into two parts to make it a little easier to digest. Is first, what we were looking at is what are people's beliefs about establishing dominance over dogs? And then we were also looking for a way to create a measurement. So it is possible that people could conceptualize benevolent or adversarial relationship when they think about establishing dominance over their dogs. And also, there really hasn't been research to our knowledge that really empirically documents dominance theory as it exists in lay popular culture, despite the fact that it's been talked about repeatedly within different organizations. And then in sort of a part 2 of study 1, we wanted to look at the relationships between masculinity and dominance theory and the use of aversive methods. But we also wanted to look at other factors that are related to our relationships with animals. So things like speciesism, beliefs in human supremacy, and empathy towards pets and wild animals. And then as a test of our logic, we wanted to look at whether the resistance to traditional gender roles predicted the opposite relationship. So to kind of make this a little clearer is that we're predicting that the adherence or the endorsement of traditional gender norms is going to predict one thing. And so if our logic is true, then the opposite should be true. So we know that people who tend to have feminist beliefs, this is an ideology that is often as strongly associated with the resistance or rejection of traditional gender norms. So we would expect to see the opposite pattern in groups of people with that sort of ideology. So just to break it down a little bit in a different way, so in study 1A, we are documenting dominance theory, and we're also creating a psychometrically valid scale in order to more accurately survey and just have a really good psychometrically valid scale in order to measure dominance theory beliefs in a population. And then in study 1B, we preliminarily examine the relationships between masculinity, feminism, empathy towards pets and wild animals, human supremacy, dominance theory, and the endorsement of aversive methods. And in that study, we're looking at the relationships between variables. So for our scale development and our documentation of dominance theory side, we asked participants about their beliefs and experience with dominance theory and establishing dominance over dogs. Items were created with basically qualitative open-ended responses from lay people. And then we also made sure to corroborate that with existing literature on dominance theory and how it exists in popular culture. And we used 2 samples of 80 people for a total of 160 in order to create our scale items. Our items focused on beliefs and attitudes and perceptions rather than the information about training techniques, although I'll be able to show you a few of those responses. And I think you'll see that people started talking about training because it just was very strongly associated with dominance for them. So we focused on things like attitudes and beliefs. Humans must be dominant over their pet dogs, and dogs do not compete with their owners for dominance. So before we get into this, I wanted to talk about what statistics and the qualitative data can tell us. And eventually in study 2, as I'll show you a little bit later, that's some experimental data. So we're looking at general trends. We're looking at group behavior. We cannot predict any one person's behavior. We're also not talking about or being informed of variables not included in this study. Study 1 is not an experiment. This is looking at the relationships between variables. And study 2 will be an experiment, and that's going to start getting more at whether something can lead to or cause a specific outcome. So, but I know that people are interested in how people do believe or dominance is established. So I have provided you all with some of the responses that people came up with in my study. All of these names are pseudonyms. They are all made up. The demographic information is real. And one of the things that we found is that nearly exclusively participants believed that dominance was established via force, fear, intimidation, control, and physical punishment. And in our study, we wanted to know why. And in part of the reason why is we think about its relationship to hegemonic masculinity. But you can see things like hit them, yell at them, keep them on a leash, cage them up. And then people did mention training measures. So they mentioned using physical measures, using a shock collar. So the way the animal fears you, and dominating the dog physically so it knows that you are the boss. So in study 1B, this is when we started to do our factor analysis and our regressions in order to get the relationships between variables. So based on an a priori power analysis, we collected 261 people. It was about 66 women to participate in an online survey. We chose a sample what naive, and this is not naive as in like the global naive sense, but what I mean by that is that we didn't pick dog trainers for this. We picked people who, one of the reasons why we wanted to pick use the undergraduate subject pool and stick with a little bit of a younger population is that this population didn't report having very much experience owning their own dogs. So they, although they had family pets and things like that. And so what we're looking at here is people who don't have these very hardened beliefs about dogs. So we're able to really get at sort of cultural influences in this population. If anyone is interested, I won't be going into the whole factor analysis or anything like that today, or what a factor analysis is. But if you are interested, our Crown Bucks alpha was at 8.8. And so that's a pretty good, reliable measure. And in this study, we were gathering preliminary evidence. So these tests are going to tell us about gender role trends. I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I think it's easier for people to keep in mind. And regression helps us understand how variables predict another variable. And then I'll also be showing you a mediation, which tells us about the mechanistic properties between the relationships between two variables. Then I'll also be showing you a moderated mediation, which shows us how another variable can impact the strength and direction of different relationships within a mediation. These are our measures if you were interested in sort of what some of the example items would have been. Our attitudes towards punishment scale was not conservative. So we asked people things like, I would hit a dog. For beliefs in human supremacy, that was things like, it is important that we treat other animal species more equally. And so these are just some of our example items. And if you're interested in this, you can always email me after and I can send you a little bit more information. So in summary, all of our predictions were supported. So we found that the endorsement of male role norms did predict greater endorsement of aversive training, greater beliefs in human supremacy, greater beliefs in speciesism, and greater beliefs in dominance theory. And we also found that it predicted lower endorsement of rewards-based training and lower empathy for pets and wild animals. And we found the exact inverse. So people who endorsed feminist identity more greatly endorsed reward-based training and empathy, and they had lower endorsement for punishment-based training methods, lower endorsement of human supremacy, lower endorsement of speciesism, lower endorsement of dominance theory. And then we did have a significant mediation model. So we found that the endorsement of male role norms mediated the relationship between dominance theory and aversive training methods. And in our moderated mediation, we found that this was especially meaningful among men. So just so the way you can see sort of what's going on here is that the male role norms inventory, the people with higher beliefs in the male role norms inventory are more likely to endorse attitudes towards punishment. And we're seeing the opposite sort of trend for people who identify as feminists. So here is our mediation model. So the endorsement of male role norms mediates or explains the relationship between the beliefs in dominance theory and attitudes towards punishment. And in a moderated mediation, we find that the endorsement of male role norms predicts the willingness to use aversive methods. And this is especially meaningful among men. So getting into study 2. So this was our experiment. So we wanted to look at the causality of dominance theory, in part because so many organizations really put a lot of emphasis that dominance theory is what was leading to the use of aversive methods. And so based off of an a priori power analysis, we collected 358 people. It was 52% men, around 70% white, and again, a really young sample. So we wanted people who didn't have who hadn't had experience with a dog trainer who might have told them about something. So these are people who are kind of fresh to this perspective. So we wanted to see if whether the exposure to dominance theory led to greater endorsement of aversive methods. And we also wanted to replicate some of our findings from study 1. It's just important to replicate your own work. And so we sort of plan this out in study 2. We randomly assigned participants to one of 3 articles. And we were thinking about this in a very externally valid way, which just sort of in a very simple way that simply means that we wanted this to be similar to what people might encounter in the real world. And so we had our articles were created by using real content on the internet, and then we aggregated the types of content to create a representative article. So we had a control article where we just exposed people to some content on dog vision. We had another article that was based off of real content on the internet from training blogs, that establishing dog dominance over dogs is important. And again, we found training blogs to compile an aggregate or summary article about establishing dominance over dogs is important. And then we also pilot tested these materials to make sure that they were perceived as equally credible, as equally negative in content, as equally positive in content, as equally interesting, as equally easy to understand, as equally easy to remember, and as equally long. And if you are interested, this is just sort of what our experimental articles did look like. And so we created these articles by creating, by aggregating different types of content on the internet to create something representative, so that it would look like something that people might, if they were Googling about their own dog, what they would encounter. So we did not find a causal relationship between beliefs in dominance theory and the use of aversive methods. And so even though there is this relationship between dominance theory and the use of aversive methods that we found in study 1, we found that our mediation, again, which basically means that the relationship between dominance theory and the use of aversive methods exists because of the beliefs, the endorsement in male role norms. So the beliefs in male role norms explains the relationship between dominance theory and the willingness to use aversives. And we also replicated, again, some of those relationships that we found in study 1, where we found that the endorsement of hegemonic masculinity led to lower empathy towards pets and wild animals. We also included some scales about attitudes towards dogs and pets in this study, and we found that people who endorsed hegemonic masculinity also have more negative attitudes towards dogs and pets in general, and they also have greater beliefs in human supremacy. And so if you just wanted to know what this looked like, again, I've displayed this sort of graphically here. And so what you can see here is that regardless of condition, we see exactly the same relationship for each condition. So male role norms, regardless of condition, predicts greater attitudes towards punishment, and feminist identification, regardless of condition, predicts lower endorsement of punishment or using aversive methods. And so what does study 2 mean? So because condition doesn't predict the endorsement of aversive methods, this suggests that mere exposure to this ideology alone might not be leading to the willingness to use aversives, but it also means that providing more nuanced information that, or like sort of like an educational sort of, doesn't really change their willingness to use aversives. We did find the same mediation model in study 1. So what this is saying is that dominance theory predicts attitudes towards aversive, but it does so because of the endorsement of hegemonic masculinity. So we're finding that the endorsement of masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, is predicting greater endorsement of aversive methods, lower empathy towards pets and wild animals, greater beliefs in human supremacy, more negative attitudes towards dogs, more negative attitudes towards pets in general, and lower endorsement of rewards-based methods. So this is ongoing work. So we do have a study 3 that we are planning. Right now, we're developing and pilot testing the materials for this study as we speak, and I'd love anybody's feedback, regardless of your background, on our next steps. We really want to get at the causal relationship between hegemonic masculinity and the willingness to use aversive. So far we've seen some pretty clear evidence for the relationship, and now it's really time to do an experiment to see whether hegemonic masculinity leads or causes the willingness to use aversive methods. And so in this talk, one of the things I was asked to do was think about these results in light of animal abuse. And one of the things that I was thinking about is that in a very young population, we're seeing that popular notions of establishing dominance is, first of all, people recognize it. They know what we're talking about. And they're also conceptualizing it as more adversarial rather than benevolent. And so these are prospective dog owners and trainers, people who are going to have their whole lifetime with dogs, and they already have a pretty good pretty strong association that establishing dominance is way more adversarial. And also in a population like this, we would expect a little bit lower adherence to gender norms because of their youth. But we still see this pressure for men to engage in styles of dog training or forms of interacting with their dogs that reflect more culturally acceptable dimensions of expressing relationships that are more manly. And then in future research, some things that I have also thought about for future research is what happens when masculinity is threatened in the context of relationships with animals. So I wanted to give a shout out to a very old article about masculinity and dog fighting. There's also intimate partner violence, for example. So the title of this talk, Kicking the Dog, is actually inspired by a panel of the Power and Control Wheel, where often pets are used as a way to manipulate, intimidate intimate partners in relationships where there's intimate partner violence. And then one of the things we were also thinking about in this research is, how does people who endorse hegemonic masculinity, how is this influencing reactions to dog aggression or perceptions of dogs being dominant? And one thing that we can imagine in future research is that maybe people react more harshly to dogs who are being perceived as dominant. And then one thing that I would really like to do in this research in the future is think about interventions. And so one thing I wanted to point out, so going back to the question that I asked you all to think about at the beginning of this presentation is, why is it important to consider how people treat animals, is in part because if you do care about animals, we have to focus on human behavior and changing it when considering the welfare of animals. So just as an example, some of the list of things that I could think about is that we can't really manage overpopulation, can't imagine dog aggression, we can't manage animal abuse and neglect, puppy socialization, etc., without the address of human behavior. So humans are going to have to change their behavior in order for us to see progress in those really important aspects of animal welfare. And then, so going back to that question at the beginning is, again, another selfish plug for humanity is that animal welfare is social justice. There is this link between hurting animals and hurting people. And while I don't want anyone to assume here, as I talk about this, that people who are using aversive training techniques are also violent or dangerous, I just wanted to talk about sort of what is out there when we think about companion animal abuse and its relationship to what is going on between people. And so often many of us have heard something called the progression or graduation hypothesis. And this is basically the idea that people start with abusing animals and then they move or escalate or graduate to abusing or being violent towards other people. But what research actually shows us is that it's often more co-occurrence rather than escalation. So we know that violent crimes against people are often associated with the abuse of companion animals. We also know that intimate partner violence, as I mentioned a little bit in the power and control wheel, often co-occurs with animal abuse. And even physical and verbal aggression towards people in one home is predicted by the abuse and murder of animals in the same home. And we also know that in adolescence, when that acts of animal abuse among children in adolescence does predict or have a relationship with peer-directed violence, as well as the adulthood perpetration of interpersonal violence. And so to end this talk, let me just summarize sort of what we've gone over today. Is that dominance theory does predict the endorsement of aversive methods, but masculinity is explaining the relationship between dominance theory and the willingness to use aversives. We also find that many people are interpreting dominance theory as establishing status through force and using aversive methods as a mechanism to do that. But their willingness to use aversives is impacted by their endorsement of hegemonic masculinity. We're also finding that regardless of gender, the endorsement of male role norms is related to more hostile attitudes and behaviors towards pets and wild animals, weaker empathy, and lower endorsement of rewards-based methods. And so for the dog trainers out there, traditional gender roles matter in terms of the training methods that might be most appealing to your clients. We're also finding that regardless of gender, feminist identification is related to the stronger endorsement of rewards-based training and greater empathy and weaker hostile ideologies towards pets and wild animals, as well as lower endorsement of aversive training techniques. And we're also finding that neither exposure to more nuanced information about the social arrangements of dogs, that social dominance isn't all about competition, aggression, nor information about the importance of establishing dominance changes attitudes towards punishment. So in sum, presenting information about dominance theory alone is likely not going to change attitudes towards aversives because of the impact of other sociocultural variables like hegemonic masculinity. And that's it, everybody.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. So I have gotten some questions in the chat. Some attendees wanted to see the chat, so I've made it so that attendees can now, in the Q&A, so attendees can now see the Q&A, so you can upvote these questions. Questions are coming in for you, Dr. Palmer. And I don't know if you see the chat, but everyone was enjoying this and learning a lot. So there are a number of questions. The first question was just a point of clarification that someone had. You said something in the very beginning about offering less spontaneous affection, and someone didn't hear you. Could you repeat that point if you know what?
Yeah, let me pull up that slide again. So I also just put the power and control wheel in the chat if anybody is interested in looking at it. But let me go back here. So what the questioner is asking is about this last bullet point here, is that dogs trained with aversive have lower quality relationships with their owners. So they're less affectionate and have less eye gaze. And those are the citations for those studies. I hope that clarifies it.
Thank you. We have lots of questions and they came in different places. So I'm gonna try to go in order. So there was a question about the articles used in study 2, establishing dominance over dogs is important. How was importance defined for that?
Yeah, so basically, so in the articles that we used is that, so like I said, we used content from real training blogs, right? And so basically what was done in the article is that, and I can show you a little bit of that as well, is that we used the exact same language that was used on these training blogs, basically, is that in order to have a well-behaved pet, you have to establish yourself as the alpha leader. And so basically in these articles, and like I said, these were based off of real training content, so we didn't make this up, is that basically people heavily emphasized in these articles that you had to become the alpha leader. And that's sort of what we mean by that it is important, is that it's being communicated to them through this article that you have to do this, if that makes sense. And so that's how importance is being operationalized, is that the content is communicating to you that this is how you have to have a successful relationship with your dog.
Thank you. Maya put something in the chat that I believe you already addressed, a bit about the ties between violence against women and violence against other animals. And someone else had a question about if there's any ties between parenting human children and training other animals. So I just wonder if you could take a little bit of time. There's a number of comments and questions about the various links between these things. So if you have any expansion on the links between dog training and the methods used and other connections, I think that the audience would like any expansion you have to offer.
Yeah, and I actually get asked a lot about parenting styles and whether this has anything to do with it. And unfortunately, there isn't a whole ton of research there. And I think that for many scholars out there in the human-animal bond, we know that the human-animal bond can actually be kind of understudied. And so there does seem to be these links between how we treat animals and treat people, but there's also a lot of gaps in this literature, right? But I think that one thing, especially in social psychology, that one thing might be interesting to you is monolithic theories of prejudice. So one of the things that we know is that the endorsement of any sort of dominance or hierarchy related ideology often predicts another one. So for example, for people high in sexism, they also tend to be high in racism. And so basically, what I'm trying to say is that there does seem to be these sorts of relationships out there, and we need way more research on them to tease them apart. And it's often very hard to find that research. And yeah, it just tends to be a little devalued. So we need a whole lot more attention to the human-animal bond. So sorry, I am so sorry that there isn't that much research on it, everybody.
Well, you have a long research agenda ahead of you after after this study.
You have a whole career left, everybody. So
how did you operationalize abuse in this study? And did it include physical or psychological intimidation without physical contact, for example?
yeah, so I will tell you that, for this talk, I did include a lot of information about animal abuse, but this study was really about aversive training techniques. And I know that this is very, very contentious in dog training, but we did, for the purposes of this research, try to distinguish between overt acts of animal abuse, things that were criminal, and actual just training techniques. And so the way that we created or dealt with those scale items is we actually use literature that was already out there. So there's actually been literature that sort of has documented how people train their dogs or what are considered those techniques. And so those were the items that we asked about for people. And so we asked them about different sorts of styles of training rather than overt animal abuse. And in future work, we will be trying to look at overt animal abuse, but it was beyond the scope of this particular research, even though there might be implications for how we think about animal abuse or downstream consequences for it. But this is way more about training techniques.
So there's some questions about training specifically, so I'll try to filter through to some of those since to dovetail off of what you just said. Within the female subjects, is higher endorsement of dominance theory statistically significant with the use of aversive training?
Yeah, we do need to figure out, yes, it is. And so for women, though, it was less meaningful. So we still need to do more research about what is going on with women. But yes, it is.
Thank you. There was a question. I'm trying to find it. And I will paraphrase if I cannot find it exactly. Here it is. If you were going to extrapolate out to dog trainers, do you have any hypothesis to the fact that those in the animal industry tend to lean female and that aversive trainers can also be female?
So could you repeat part 2 of the question?
Yes. Do you have any hypothesis to the fact that those in the animal industry tend to be female and that aversive trainers can also be female?
Yeah. So this is very, very interesting to me. So there have been some research that shows that that among women trainers are more likely to use rewards-based methods. But like I said, we still need to do some research about what's going on with women. We do see that these variables, so like, for example, beliefs in human supremacy predict the endorsement of aversive methods. We see things like dominance theory are predicting the endorsement of aversive methods. And as I mentioned before, hegemonic masculinity and many of the variables that we talked about are cultural ideologies. And so women can endorse them, but masculinity is more central to men's identity. And so when we often see masculinity threat, for example, it tends to impact men's behavior more than it does women's behavior. And I will say that I wish there was more research in the human animal bond so that way I could give you a definitive hypothesis here. But it's more so that women are not exactly off the hook here, if that makes sense. That women can absolutely uphold some pretty negative beliefs, and it can influence their behavior, even if maybe they're not so worried about being perceived as a masculine woman. It can still really influence their behavior about what is culturally acceptable.
So we've talked about gender quite a bit. A number of people have upvoted this question. Did you find any other demographic or personality variables that mediated the support of aversives, like culture, sexual orientation, political orientation?
Yeah, so one of the things we did want to look at is political orientation. So stay tuned for the paper because we will be looking at that. And we are seeing that there are some other relationships out there, but we haven't looked at things like race. If you looked at the sample that I saw, like it was 70% white. So we have some pretty unequal sample sizes there. And so we haven't been able to do some of those fine-tuned demographic examinations, and that will likely require a whole other study is to look at those sorts of differences. But I imagine that there are out there, and as I mentioned before, is that there's a whole host of variables that we didn't look at, and so it does warrant future investigation to start looking at those other demographic information. But what we were really looking at here was largely the differences between men and women and what was going on there.
Well, since we are talking about demographics, I wonder if you could answer this question about your second study. Do you think that younger generations, since you have a younger generation in that sample, younger group, that younger generations may just have differences in their beliefs and has hegemonic masculinity than older generations? And would that have even affected this study?
So, what's very interesting about younger generations, and I've been studying things like prejudice and stigma for a little while now, and there's almost sort of a paradox where you do see, for example, things like these, like the adherence to traditional gender norms change over time, but it's not necessarily that there's like this stark contrast and that young people are just 100% different from older generations. And so young people can still strongly adhere to gender norms, but what we do expect from younger populations is actually that they would have, lower endorsement or lower adherence, which I mentioned, than an older population. And so in this research, we actually might be underestimating the effect size or the effect of hegemonic masculinity on behavior, because we are looking at a population that tends to have lower adherence to traditional gender norms than other populations. And so that will be something that we write about in a limitation to generalizability in the study, is that I would expect a greater effect in a sample that was older, and yeah, so that's sort of what I'm thinking about with younger people.
Thank you. So a lot of people are very interested in this question, and it's also about study 2. If reading articles didn't influence naive folks' willingness to use aversives versus not to use aversives, do you think there are messages or information force-free trainers could use that would be more impactful?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. I don't, from what I have learned from my study, is that education alone might not be changing people's willingness to use aversive methods. There's something else going on there that is cultural. And so some sorts of messages that I am thinking about is trying to have conversations with people about why they're using those methods. Particularly, I think that, so we know that, for example, public discomfort is greater in people who endorse hegemonic masculinity. So not being perceived as masculine in public can lead men to be more likely to engage in compensatory acts. So for example, if you have a client who maybe has a leash reactive dog and strongly endorses hegemonic masculinity, even though you've given them all of this education about using positive punishment, in that situation, they might be more likely to use positive punishment in order to be perceived as masculine and to like sort of abate their public discomfort. And so what that would mean is that where you need to intervene is not necessarily on their education, but that positive reinforcement can actually be an enactment of being a healthy masculine person, that positive reinforcement isn't being too soft or too gentle or something. But I will say that like interventions are a science. They are things that need to be tested. So, and we don't have any empirical evidence right now about what sorts of interventions would be necessary in order to change people's cultural beliefs or their behavior of using aversive methods. That was just my science caveat. So,
well, since you're dealing with the science caveat, there's another question a lot of people have voted here. R+ training, I assume, is positive reinforcement training.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm clearly not from the dog training world myself, and I learned a lot today. So this question is: there are a number of ongoing discussions in the R+ dog training community about how to better sell this training. Amongst peers, we agree that it is less flashy, but the general populace doesn't seem swayed by scientific data. Do you have thoughts on what alternate discussion points may be salient? And you might have just answered that, but I'd like to know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that something that I've heard from dog trainers is that some people are just unwilling, like for whatever cultural script or schema that they have, it's very difficult for them to imagine um, a well-mannered dog who hasn't been punished. They sort of think that like reward-based training is somehow not holding the dog accountable, which is also just a weird phrase, but this is what people tell me. Not holding accountable for their behavior, or that you're accidentally, inadvertently reinforcing things like aggression or something if you're not punishing it. And so to me, again, that's just like something deeply ingrained culturally. And so we have to I think that a lot of the messages that I see in dog training, it's always educational. It's always an education intervention. And the assumption is that if we give people enough education, that they're just going to come to this conclusion to use positive reinforcement. But it does seem that like the messages that dog trainers should also be using are simply just cultural. So we have to start looking at cultural behavior and changing human behavior around how we interact with animals. And so I think that like, so for example, just like variables like, oh, I see someone just saying rather than it. I am so sorry. I am like trained in social psychology. So, but so for animals, I do think that like we need to really rethink our cultural relationships with animals. And even I just called animals its, and that's something that I have to be rethinking and unlearning all of the time.
Thank you. I have a couple questions here about other relationships that you might have looked at or you might be considering looking at in the future. So I'll just rattle some of them off. Someone is interested if you've gone on to consider some of these same things in the equine industry.
Yeah, about horses. Yeah, I've seen actually a lot of research or more research lately looking at positive reinforcement and the effects on horses. But hasn't been the relationships with horses isn't a relationship that I've been interrogating as of late. But it's something that I will likely be looking at in the future, is just our relationship with other types of companion animals.
So another question is, have you thought about the connection between sort of domestic versus working animals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's actually just a very interesting question. Is that I mean, in terms of breeding a lot, right? We often think of like what is a pet quality dog versus like a working line dog, and we know that that often has a lot of implications on the relationship that that animal is going to have with its people. So, for example, if its energy level is very difficult to manage, it might make it very hard for this animal to be successful and happy in their home. And so it's something that I do in future research do want to start to look at and investigate. It's sort of people's perceptions around these things. And but yeah, there hasn't been a whole lot of research, I think, in how we interact with domestic versus like working line animals.
I don't want to run out of time before I get to some questions about you and what you're doing. So there's a few different questions. People are interested in the best way to follow you, whether this has been studied, and what's up next for you. I mean, sorry, whether the study has been published and or these studies, and what is up next for you.
Yeah, so right now, everybody, I'm a postdoc. I will be looking for a job after my postdoc. So if you hear about any job opportunities, please keep me in mind. I do plan on trying to continue researching the human-animal bond for the rest of my career. So I plan on attending the Human and Animal Studies Institute this summer at UIC to get more training and thinking about the human-animal bond. And these sets of studies will be published in the future. But we still have some more work to do. So we are working on study 3. We're pilot testing right now. Good research does take a little bit of time. And but yeah, these are things that I will be continuing to work on. And I don't know exactly what my future career will hold. because I am still a postdoc, but hopefully it will be in a position where I'll be able to continue this research for the foreseeable future.
Are you comfortable if people reach out to you? And is there any way people can follow your work?
Yeah, so people can definitely reach out to me. Right now, I am at the University of Massachusetts-Chan Medical School, and you can just Google me. If you just Google Dr. Lindsay Palmer, my contact information comes up. I am also on LinkedIn, and I will put into the chat my institutional email, and you all can always email me there and answer questions. I'm also happy to Zoom with people if people really want to chat more about this. I'm always very happy to disseminate whatever sorts of research people find helpful.
Thank you. And I'll give you a moment to type that. There you go. There were some other questions about other variables that you've looked at. So did you do anything with political party ideology? Did you look at whether people had experienced corporal punishment? I think those are the two that I see.
So we didn't ask people about their experiences with corporal punishment. That will be that's going to be a little hard to get past an IRB. I think we'll have to be really mindful that we're not harming participants in any way by asking them to recall that sorts of information. So that's definitely future study material because that's very sensitive to invoking participants. But we did ask about political ideology, and that's still a variable that we're investigating. And I am sorry that I am so conservative, but I try to avoid talking about data that I still am myself investigating.
Thank you. Here's a question that probably has the most upvotes. I don't know how I missed it. So we will let this be the last question since we're almost out of time. I wonder about the relationship between verbal expression and overt behavior. Traditional Western men are socialized not to express nurturative emotions, but I'm not sure that means they don't feel affection towards dogs and express that privately in overt behavior. I have anecdotes to back that up, but not sure about any studies.
Yeah, I mean, Stoicism is something that has been researched in masculinity. And I would imagine that men do love their pets. But what we're seeing, and if you look at the study and Chris Blazina is the researcher there, and he actually has a book about men and dogs if you were more interested about these relationships. But part of what is going on is that we're talking about masking and underreporting their affection. And so there is this social pressure for men to mask it. And that can happen in both private situations as well as public situations. But what we often see with masculinity is that there is greater public discomfort. So men would be more likely to mask their emotions in the presence or the influence of other people.
Thank you. So we are almost at time, so I want to get everyone out of here on time. I'm sorry to those of you whose questions I did not get a chance to get to. This was a really lively question and answer board and a really lively chat as well. And Lindsay, I will try to send you the chat afterwards so that you can catch up on everything since you were busy talking. I will be sending out a recording in the next couple days after it's prepared from this talk to everyone who's registered. So all of you will have a recording of this as well. Dr. Palmer, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful talk and the wonderful and very high level and thorough research that you're doing on such an important topic. This was really interesting and I really enjoyed it. Gayla, did you have anything to say before we leave?
No, just thank you to Lindsay and all the participants. It was a very lively discussion and great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.